A moment on the South Side. In the heart of a sunny Chicago afternoon, the hum of life vibrated along the busy streets of the South Side. Vendors lined the sidewalks, families walked together, and kids played by the steps of the local grocery store. People were going about their daily routines, wrapped in their own stories and worries, when a sudden disturbance pierced the peaceful scene. A cop car had pulled up outside the grocery store, and from it emerged a tall, stern-faced police officer, his badge catching the glint of the midday sun. He scanned the crowd before his gaze landed on a young black woman standing alone on the corner, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans. She held a grocery bag in one hand, seemingly unaware of the officer's intense focus on her. The woman's name was Aisha Carter. She was a social worker with a quiet demeanor, but a deeply rooted belief in the power of kindness and understanding. For her, these weren't just ideals. They were principles she lived by, values she defended in her work with at-risk youth and struggling families. Today, however, her faith was about to be tested. The officer, whose name tag read Officer Randall Jackson, squared his shoulders and approached her with a look that could cut steel. He exuded authority, and his footsteps echoed a confidence that spoke of control, a control that, in his eyes, seemed threatened by Aisha's mere presence. "You got business here." His voice was cold, cutting through the air as he stopped a mere foot away from her. Aisha looked up, meeting his gaze with calmness rather than the expected shock. She knew what this was about. She'd seen it before, felt it before. It was an all-too-common occurrence for people like her to be questioned for simply existing, for standing on a street corner that didn't belong to them. She held her ground, choosing silence over confrontation, hoping her stillness would diffuse the tension that was quickly building. But Officer Jackson wasn't finished. "I asked you a question," he insisted, louder this time, as he leaned in with an edge of hostility. Around them, people began to take notice, some halting their steps to watch, others nervously glancing away. A few brave bystanders discreetly pulled out their phones, prepared to document whatever might unfold next. "I'm just waiting for my friend," Aisha replied, her voice measured and polite. She wasn't trying to escalate things. She was trying to survive an encounter that she knew could quickly turn dangerous. But her words did little to calm him. "Waiting, huh? You look like you're up to something," he sneered, his hand resting just inches from his belt, where his weapon hung as a quiet threat. "Don't lie to me, miss." Aisha's heart pounded in her chest, her instincts screaming at her to back down, to avoid confrontation. But something else surged within her, something stronger than fear. She could feel the weight of all the people who had been in her shoes, who had faced this same treatment for nothing more than the color of their skin or their presence in a place deemed out of bounds. And so, she did something she never expected herself to do. She took a small step closer to the officer, meeting his intense glare with a calmness that seemed to baffle him. "Officer, are you okay?" she asked, her tone gentle yet firm. Her question hung in the air like an unexpected breeze on a sweltering day, cooling the hostility just enough to cause a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Jackson was thrown off balance. He had braced himself for anger, for defiance. But this was kindness, and it cut through his armor in a way he wasn't prepared for. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The hard edge in his gaze softened, if only for a moment. "What did you say?" he asked, confusion twisting his features as he tried to process the question. "I asked if you're okay," Aisha repeated, a small, sincere smile crossing her lips. "You seem tense, maybe a little stressed. Are you all right?" The crowd around them shifted, watching the encounter with wide eyes and bated breath. People were used to seeing confrontations escalate. They weren't used to seeing them de-escalate. But Aisha wasn't concerned about appearances. She genuinely wanted to know. Years in social work had taught her that anger often masked deeper pain, and she wondered if, beneath his hostility, there was something he hadn't shared with anyone. The officer blinked, clearly stunned. He looked around at the gathering crowd, the phones pointed at him, the judgment in people's eyes. He took a small step back, visibly unnerved, his hand dropping away from his belt. "I don't need your help," he stammered, his voice less certain now. Just follow the law, and there won't be any issues." Aisha held his gaze, noting the strain in his eyes, the telltale signs of exhaustion etched in his face. "You know," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering, "we're all human. We all carry our own burdens. Whatever yours is, it doesn't have to weigh you down alone." For a moment, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Something broken, almost vulnerable. The arrogance and authority that he wore like a shield faltered, replaced by a quiet weariness. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by the stoic mask of professionalism. Jackson straightened up, his jaw tightening as he wrestled back his composure. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, though the force behind his words had lost its bite. "I understand," Aisha said, nodding. "But maybe we don't always have to see each other as enemies. Sometimes a little understanding goes a long way." The crowd murmured in agreement, the tension slowly dissolving as Aisha's words hung in the air. A few onlookers nodded, their gazes softening as they witnessed the remarkable change in the energy around them. Officer Jackson glanced around, visibly uncomfortable with the shift in the crowd's perception of him. Aisha took a small step back, giving him space. "Look, if you ever need someone to talk to," she added, "I work at the community center just a few blocks from here. We're here to help, even for officers like yourself." Jackson said nothing, but the hardness in his expression softened ever so slightly. He hesitated, as if considering her words, before nodding curtly and stepping back towards his squad car. Without another word, he climbed into the vehicle, his gaze lingering on Aisha for just a moment before he drove away. As the car pulled away, the crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, dispersing with murmurs of admiration for Aisha's unexpected act of compassion. Some of the bystanders approached her, offering words of gratitude and respect. But Aisha wasn't looking for praise. She had only wanted to remind someone who seemed lost in his own pain, that empathy could bridge the most unlikely divides. She hoped, in some small way, that her words had planted a seed of change in him. As she walked away from the scene, her heart heavy but hopeful, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She didn't know if Officer Jackson would ever reach out or if he would return to his old ways, but she did know that kindness, even in the face of hostility, had the power to change the course of a moment, and maybe even a life. An unexpected reunion. Days had passed since Aisha's encounter with Officer Jackson, yet the memory of it lingered with an intensity that surprised her. She had faced difficult moments before, moments where hostility and kindness collided, but something about her exchange with Officer Jackson had felt different. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, a flash of vulnerability that slipped through his hardened exterior, or maybe it was the reaction of the community that had witnessed the incident. Aisha wasn't sure. Meanwhile, the event had not gone unnoticed by others either. A video of the encounter, recorded by an onlooker, had started circulating on social media. In it, Aisha's calm response to Officer Jackson's aggression sparked a discussion. People in the community spoke up about their own experiences with him and the broader issue of tensions between police officers and the communities they served. But what stood out the most were the comments praising Aisha's approach, the courage it took to meet anger with empathy and fear with understanding. Though the attention made her uncomfortable, Aisha knew it was necessary to have these conversations. She'd spent years helping families navigate trauma, conflict, and crisis. Her work as a social worker was her way of giving back to the community that had shaped her. Still, she didn't want the story to become just another fleeting viral moment. Real change, she believed, was born in quiet conversations and brave actions taken one person at a time. That Friday, Aisha returned to the community center where she worked. The center was her haven, a place where she knew she could make a difference. It was a simple building with cracked walls and aging furniture, but it served as a vital resource for countless families in the neighborhood. From tutoring sessions and after-school programs to counseling services and job assistance, the center was a lifeline for many, and Aisha was its heart. As she walked into her office, her assistant, Mia, peeked through the doorway with a mischievous grin. "Guess who's here to see you?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Aisha gave her a puzzled look, shrugging. "No idea." "Who?" Mia stepped aside, and standing in the doorway was none other than Officer Jackson. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see him again, much less in her own workspace. His posture was tense, hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze flitting around the room as if he were an outsider in unfamiliar territory. For a brief moment, Aisha wondered if he was here to confront her about the video. But as she looked closer, she saw something else. Hesitation, perhaps even regret. "Officer Jackson," she said, composing herself and offering a small, welcoming smile. "This is a surprise." He cleared his throat, nodding curtly. "Yeah, I wanted to talk. If that's all right." "Of course," she replied, gesturing toward a chair by her desk. "Please, have a seat." He sat down slowly, looking more like a man facing judgment than a figure of authority. Aisha settled into her chair across from him, the room thick with unspoken tension. She could sense he was wrestling with his words, struggling to articulate something that was buried beneath layers of pride and pain. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound between them. Finally, Jackson exhaled sharply, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for how I acted the other day." Aisha's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She hadn't expected this. The Officer Jackson, she remembered, was a man who stood tall, demanding respect and exuding authority. Yet here he was, speaking with a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you for saying that," Aisha replied gently. "But it's not just about me. I think the community feels the impact of moments like these, of how interactions like ours can shape their sense of safety and trust." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know. I've been struggling. This job, it's harder than I thought it would be." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "People assume cops don't have problems of their own, that we're invincible or something. But we're just people, too." Aisha listened closely, nodding in understanding. She knew better than most how invisible pain could build and fester. People often carried their burdens in silence, allowing them to shape who they became without even realizing it. She saw it in the youth she worked with every day, and now, in the man sitting before her. "You know," she began thoughtfully, "it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Jackson scoffed, though there was no malice in it. "Cops don't ask for help, Miss Carter. It's not how we're trained." Aisha leaned forward, her eyes filled with empathy. "That's a shame, Officer Jackson, because everyone deserves support, even those who wear a badge." For the first time, his hardened exterior seemed to crack. His shoulders sagged, and he looked away, his voice softening. "I used to think I could handle it all, that I'd be the cop who made a difference, you know. But lately, I don't know. I feel like I'm drowning." Aisha reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're not alone, Officer Jackson. You don't have to be. Sometimes, admitting we're struggling is the strongest thing we can do." They sat in silence again, but this time, it was a silence filled with mutual understanding. Aisha felt a warmth in her chest, a spark of hope that perhaps this moment could be the beginning of something greater, for him and for their community. After a few moments, Jackson took a deep breath, looking back at her with a newfound determination. "I want to change," he admitted quietly. "I want to do better. I don't want people to see me as the enemy." Aisha nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Then maybe that's where we start. Here together. You're welcome to come by the center whenever you need to talk, or if you'd like to get to know the community. We have open programs that you could participate in, if you're interested." The officer looked at her, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. Really? You'd be okay with that? Absolutely, Aisha replied warmly. It's never too late to start building bridges. And it's clear to me that you want to make things right. That's a powerful step forward. Jackson nodded, swallowing hard as he looked around the modest but welcoming space. Maybe I'll take you up on that, he said, his voice tinged with a hint of relief. Maybe this is what I need, what we all need. As he rose to leave, Aisha watched him with a sense of hope. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and struggles, and not everyone would welcome his presence with open arms. But if there was one thing she believed in, it was the potential for change. One small, brave step at a time. And as Officer Jackson left the community center that day, a small but powerful seed had been planted in his heart, one that would push him to see the world, and his role in it, in a different light, a step into the unknown. The following week, Officer Jackson found himself back at the community center, a decision that felt both foreign and strangely necessary. He had wrestled with himself the entire drive over, torn between the voices in his head, one telling him to stay away and handle things as he always had, the other urging him to take a leap, to break the cycle that had trapped him in resentment and suspicion for so long. He walked up the worn steps of the community center, his uniform feeling heavier than usual. This time, he wasn't here with authority. He was here as a man looking for change. It was a humbling realization, and the vulnerability gnawed at him. Yet the memory of Aisha's words lingered, grounding him, reminding him that this moment might be his opportunity to reshape his perspective, and maybe, in time, reshape how others saw him too. Inside, the community center was alive with activity. In one corner, teenagers gathered around an old computer, laughing and helping each other with homework. In another room, an elder taught a group of younger children how to paint, their laughter ringing out like music. The center buzzed with a sense of unity and purpose that Jackson hadn't seen in his line of work, where he often dealt with people on their worst days, witnessing moments of despair rather than togetherness. As he entered the main hall, he spotted Aisha talking to a group of kids. She was kneeling to meet them at eye level, her voice soft and encouraging, as she explained the project they'd be working on that day. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with excitement. One little girl was clutching a stack of colored paper, nodding eagerly as Aisha spoke. Seeing Aisha in her element brought a strange warmth to Jackson's chest. He realized that here, she was more than just a social worker. She was a mentor, a guide, someone the community turned to and trusted. And in that moment, he understood just how much he had misjudged her during their first encounter. He felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside, reminding himself that he was here to learn. Aisha looked up and noticed him, a welcoming smile spreading across her face. She rose and approached him, her demeanor as warm as the first time they'd met, but without the tension that had lingered between them. "Officer Jackson," she greeted him, extending a hand. "I'm glad you came back." "Please call me Randall," he replied, shaking her hand. The formality of his title felt out of place here, where everything seemed so personal and genuine. She nodded. "All right, Randall. I'm glad you're here. Would you like to join us? We're just starting an art project with the kids." He glanced at the group of children who were now watching him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. A few whispered among themselves, clearly wondering what a police officer was doing here. Randall felt the familiar urge to put up his guard, to assert his authority and remind them of his position. But he resisted. He reminded himself of his purpose, of the commitment he'd made to try something new. "Sure," he said, forcing himself to relax. "I'd love to join." The kids exchanged glances, unsure of how to react, but Aisha stepped in smoothly, guiding him to a spot at the table where the children were gathered. She handed him a stack of colored paper and a pair of scissors. "We're making gratitude cards," she explained. "It's a project we do once a month to help the kids focus on the positive things in their lives, to give them a way to express what they're thankful for." Randall looked at the paper in his hands, feeling a bit out of his depth. Craft projects and gratitude exercises were far from his comfort zone. But he glanced at the kids, some of whom were watching him with cautious eyes, and he knew that this was his chance to show them something different, to maybe plant a seed of trust. He took a deep breath, grabbing a purple sheet of paper and folding it in half, just as he saw the children doing. "So, what are you all writing on your cards?" he asked, his voice gentle, trying to bridge the gap between them. A little boy named Jamal, with bright eyes and a shy smile, looked up at him. "I'm writing that I'm thankful for my grandma." The ripple effect. Weeks passed since Officer Jackson's visit to the community center, and the South Side began noticing small, subtle changes in his presence. He was still a police officer, patrolling the streets, but the way he interacted with people had shifted. He no longer approached every interaction with the defensive edge he once held. Instead, he appeared more open, more present, and even, at times, receptive to the concerns of the people he served. But change is rarely smooth, and Jackson's journey was met with challenges he hadn't anticipated. One Saturday morning, he decided to visit the center again, this time dressed in plain clothes to avoid the unease his uniform sometimes caused. The moment he entered, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations dropped to a murmur, and a few people glanced over with suspicion and curiosity. Jackson's reputation as the aggressive cop still lingered in many minds, and while some had noticed his gentler approach, trust wasn't something that came easily here. Aisha saw him the moment he walked in, offering him a welcoming smile that melted away a bit of his own apprehension. She was hosting a workshop on community healing, and the room was filled with locals of all ages, discussing topics like resilience, understanding, and mutual respect. Jackson quietly took a seat in the back, observing the discussions with an attentive gaze. "All right, everyone," Aisha announced with a warm voice. "Today, we're talking about the power of forgiveness and the strength it takes to open our hearts, even when we've been hurt. So I'd like each of you to share a time when you found the courage to forgive, even when it wasn't easy." A few people began sharing their stories, from family struggles to betrayals among friends. The stories ranged from heartwarming to heartbreaking, each one a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Jackson listened intently, his heart stirring as he realized that the experiences shared weren't all that different from his own battles, from the anger he carried over his personal life and the pressures of his job. He realized he had more in common with these people than he had ever considered. When the turn came for him to share, Aisha looked at him with a gentle nod, encouraging him to speak if he wanted. He hesitated, then took a deep breath and began. "There was a time," Jackson started, his voice a bit shaky, "when I thought being a cop meant I had to be hard, unbreakable. I thought showing any kind of emotion or weakness made me less effective, so I kept everything bottled up. But I realize now that approach did more harm than good, both to me and to others." The room was silent, eyes fixed on him as he continued. "I was going through a lot. Losing my mom, problems in my marriage. I didn't talk to anyone about it. I just kept it inside, and I guess that started to come out in the way I treated people on the job. I know I hurt people because I was hurting, and I'm sorry for that. I don't know if anyone here has seen me act that way, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of surprise and understanding. A few nodded, acknowledging the vulnerability he had shown. It was rare for people to see a police officer admit to personal struggles, to show a side that was raw and unguarded. As he finished, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jacobs, who had lived in the neighborhood her entire life, raised her hand. "Officer Jackson," she said in a strong but gentle voice, "we've all been through things that make us act in ways we're not proud of. But acknowledging it and trying to be better, that's a start. My husband used to be like you, always carrying burdens in silence. It wore him down, but he, too, found his way back by opening his heart to others." She paused, giving him a knowing look. "You're on the right path, young man." Jackson nodded, grateful for her words. For the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, the community could accept him not just as an authority figure, but as one of their own. Someone who was learning, growing, and trying to make amends. After the workshop, a few people approached him, sharing words of encouragement and asking questions about his work. Some of them even expressed their own frustrations with the police force, explaining the impact of negative experiences they'd had with officers. Instead of getting defensive, Jackson listened, taking in their concerns with empathy he hadn't fully realized he was capable of before. Later, as he was getting ready to leave, Aisha caught up with him near the door. "You were brave today," she said, smiling. "Not everyone is willing to open up in a room full of people who may not trust them." He chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck. "To be honest, I wasn't sure if they'd even want me here. But it felt good, you know. To just talk, to be heard." Aisha nodded, her eyes warm with encouragement. "Change takes time, Jackson, but you're taking the right steps. The more people see you as a human being, one willing to understand and learn, the more they'll be open to trusting you. You're becoming part of the community, not just an outsider enforcing rules." As he left the center, Jackson felt a newfound sense of hope and purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. He knew he still had a long way to go, and there would be people who might never forgive him for his past behavior. But he was determined to keep showing up, to continue his journey of self-reflection and growth. The following days saw Jackson returning to the community center more frequently, sometimes helping with programs, sometimes just listening to the stories of the locals. Word spread throughout the neighborhood, and slowly the walls between him and the community began to break down, one genuine interaction at a time. But with his growing connection to the community came resistance from some of his fellow officers. They noticed his shift in attitude, his softer approach, and questioned whether he was losing his edge. Some warned him that his actions would make him vulnerable, that he was stepping into dangerous territory by aligning himself too closely with the people he was supposed to control. Jackson faced these criticisms with newfound resilience, fueled by the support he felt from the community. He knew his colleagues might never understand the changes he was making, but he also knew that he was becoming someone he could respect. A protector, not an enforcer. A listener, not a judge. One evening, as he was leaving the center, he ran into Mrs. Jacobs again. She was heading home after a late volunteer shift, and they walked together down the quiet street. "You know, Officer Jackson," she said, her voice thoughtful, "people used to say that our neighborhood would never be safe. They thought we couldn't look after ourselves, that we needed policing to keep us in line. But what we really need is understanding, compassion, and a little faith." Jackson nodded, absorbing her words. He realized now that real safety wasn't just about preventing crime. It was about creating a space where people felt respected, seen, and valued. It was about building trust, even if it took time, and even if it meant tearing down old walls. As they reached her home, Mrs. Jacobs looked at him with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Keep going, son. You're doing good work here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jackson thanked her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had never felt this way about his job before, but as he walked back to his patrol car, he realized that he had finally found his purpose, not in power, but in service. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he had the strength of a community behind him and the power of kindness guiding him forward. Trials and turning points. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow over the south side streets as Officer Jackson drove his squad car through the neighborhood. He was coming to understand more deeply each day. His relationship with the community had evolved, yet it was fragile, a delicate bond built on small moments of kindness and trust that could be easily shattered. He'd learned that being part of the community didn't mean just showing up when things were calm. It meant standing with people when things got hard, and the test of that commitment was fast approaching. As he pulled up to the community center, he noticed a crowd gathering on the corner, voices raised in anger and concern. Tensions seemed to simmer in the air, heavy and palpable. He parked his car a block away, choosing to approach on foot to avoid drawing immediate attention to himself. As he moved closer, he could see the source of the disturbance. A young man, Jaden, stood surrounded by several people, visibly agitated, his voice carrying above the murmurs of the crowd. Aisha was there, trying to calm him down, her voice gentle yet firm. Jaden was one of the teenagers Aisha worked with at the center, a bright kid who had been caught up in trouble a few times but was trying to find his footing. Jackson noticed something familiar in Jaden's expression, a mix of frustration, fear, and defiance, the same look he had seen countless times on his own face in the mirror during his darkest days. Without thinking, Jackson stepped into the crowd, his presence causing a ripple of surprise and, for some, mistrust. "Officer Jackson, this isn't the time," someone muttered under their breath, loud enough for him to hear. He held up a hand, signaling that he wasn't here to make things worse. He wasn't here as just an authority figure. He was here as someone who had been through his own struggles and had made a commitment to help, not harm. "Jaden," he called, his voice calm but firm, catching the young man's attention. Jaden turned, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and desperation. "What do you want, man?" he spat, the defiance clear in his tone. "You here to arrest me? Go ahead. Everyone already thinks I'm trouble anyway." Jackson shook his head, his gaze steady. "I'm not here to arrest you, Jaden. I'm here because I care about what's happening to you." The crowd murmured, taken aback by Jackson's words. Jaden blinked, caught off guard, his defensive stance faltering for a brief moment. Aisha watched, her expression softening as she realized Jackson's intentions. "Look," Jackson continued, taking a step closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I know things feel like they're stacked against you. I know how easy it is to feel trapped, like no one's on your side. But you don't have to go through this alone. We're here for you." Jaden's eyes narrowed, but his anger seemed to give way to something else, something vulnerable. He looked around at the faces watching him, the people in the community who had always seen him as a troublemaker, as a lost cause. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing the possibility of something different, a path that didn't lead to further isolation and resentment. "What am I supposed to do then?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm just trying to survive out here, but nobody cares about that." Jackson took a deep breath, recalling his own journey and the nights he'd spent wrestling with his demons. "Surviving isn't enough, Jaden. You deserve to live. To really live, without fear, without feeling like you're alone in this. I didn't always get it, but people like Aisha, they're here to help you find your way, even if it's hard, even if it feels like no one's listening." Aisha stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder. "We're here for you, Jaden. This community is here for you, but you've got to let us in, got to let us help you, even when it feels impossible." Jaden's shoulders sagged, the weight of his anger and pain finally releasing, if only a little. He nodded slowly, glancing at Jackson with a look of guarded hope. "All right," he said, his voice cracking. "All right, I'll try." The crowd began to disperse, the tense energy replaced by a quieter, more contemplative atmosphere. People exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly at Jackson, others simply watching in silence, processing what they had witnessed. Jackson felt a surge of relief, but he knew this was just one moment in a journey that would require many more. As Aisha and Jackson walked Jaden back to the community center, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the path he had chosen. For once, he didn't feel like an outsider, an enforcer. He felt like part of a solution, part of something bigger than himself. However, not everyone was pleased with his approach. Later that evening, as he returned to the precinct, Jackson found himself called into the captain's office. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran of the force with a reputation for his strict adherence to rules, looked at him with a hardened expression as Jackson stepped inside. "Jackson," he began, his tone clipped, "I've been hearing things about your recent behavior, this community outreach, these discussions with suspects instead of arrests. What exactly is your angle here?" Jackson straightened, a flicker of determination sparking in his eyes. "Captain, with all due respect, I'm trying to build bridges. These people, they're not just faces in a report. They're real people with struggles we can't always see from behind a badge." Reynolds leaned back, his gaze steely. "That may be, but we're not social workers, Jackson. We're here to keep order. If you get too close, too involved, you'll lose sight of that. You need to remember where your loyalty lies." Jackson felt a surge of frustration, but he kept his tone calm. "With all due respect, sir, maybe our loyalty should be with the community we're sworn to protect. Building trust doesn't weaken us, it makes us stronger. People are more likely to cooperate if they feel respected." The captain shook his head, his expression one of mild disdain. "Just be careful, Jackson. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. Remember, there's a thin line between being part of the community and losing control of it." As Jackson left the office, his mind was swirling with thoughts. He understood the captain's concerns, but he couldn't ignore the difference he was seeing, both in himself and in the community. His connection to the people on the South Side was real, and it was making an impact, even if some of his colleagues couldn't see it yet. Over the next few weeks, Jackson continued to show up at the community center, participating in events, lending a hand where needed, and listening to the stories of those around him. His relationship with Jaden grew, too, and soon the young man began attending counseling sessions that Aisha had arranged. Slowly but surely, Jaden was finding a new path, and Jackson felt a sense of pride watching his transformation. But his involvement was also drawing attention from others in the neighborhood, people who hadn't been as willing to forgive his past. One afternoon, as Jackson left the center, he found himself confronted by a group of local men who had once had run-ins with him. They blocked his path, their expressions cold and unyielding. "Thought you could just walk around here like one of us now," one of them sneered. "After all the stuff you pulled before." Jackson held his hands up, keeping his voice calm. "I know I made mistakes, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I'm just trying to make things right, to be here for the community." The men exchanged skeptical glances, but one of them, a tall man named Ray, stepped forward. His face softened just enough to reveal a glimmer of understanding. "People around here don't forget easy, Officer Jackson. But if you're serious, then keep showing up. Keep proving yourself. Maybe, just maybe, we'll start to believe you." Jackson nodded, grateful for even a small chance. "I'll keep showing up, Ray. That's a promise." As he walked away, he knew that his journey toward redemption wasn't going to be a smooth one. There would be setbacks, days when his past might overshadow his intentions, and moments of doubt, but he was committed to this path, to becoming someone the community could rely on, someone they could trust. In his heart, Jackson felt the stirrings of a purpose greater than himself, a purpose he was finally ready to embrace, one act of kindness at a time. A new dawn for the South Side. A month had passed since Officer Jackson's commitment to bridging the divide with the South Side community. Small victories had begun to take root, transforming the lives of the people around him, even as old scars took time to heal. Jackson had slowly earned a cautious trust, but he knew that change was fragile. It was a bond that needed nurturing, and he was determined not to let it unravel. One crisp autumn morning, Jackson arrived at the community center to find it bustling with preparations for the annual South Side Unity Festival. The event had been Aisha's brainchild, a day of celebration, understanding, and joy for everyone in the community. Local vendors set up booths along the street, kids painted colorful murals, and musicians rehearsed on a small stage at the park. Everywhere Jackson looked, there were faces he had come to know, People he had once approached with suspicion, but now greeted with a warm nod or a friendly wave. Aisha spotted him in the crowd and walked over with a smile. "Glad you could make it early," she said, handing him a volunteer badge. "We could use an extra set of hands." Jackson chuckled, pinning the badge to his shirt. "I'm here to help however I can. What do you need me to do?" She pointed toward a booth where an elderly couple struggled to set up tables for their display of handcrafted jewelry and paintings. "Mr. and Mrs. Sanchez need some help with their booth, and after that, you might want to check in with Jaden. He's helping with the kids' activities, but I think he's a little nervous." Jackson nodded and headed over to assist the Sanchezes. As he worked alongside them, arranging tables and setting out jewelry, the elderly couple shared stories of their life in the neighborhood, how it had changed over the years, and their hopes for the future. Jackson listened intently, absorbing the pride they felt in their community. It was the kind of pride he hadn't fully understood before, but he was beginning to feel it himself. When he finished with the Sanchezes, he made his way over to the children's area, where Jaden was attempting to wrangle a group of energetic kids. They were running in circles, their laughter filling the air, while Jaden tried to organize a game of tag. "Need some backup, coach," Jackson called out with a grin, catching Jaden's attention. Jaden laughed, visibly relieved. "Please, I think they're starting a revolution over here." Jackson stepped in, calling the kids over with a playful officer's orders. They gathered around him, giggling and chattering, captivated by the novelty of a police officer leading their game. As he helped organize the group, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Here, in this moment, he was more than a badge or a uniform. He was part of something real, something that mattered. The festival was in full swing by midday, with music, food, and laughter filling the air. Jackson spent time wandering through the crowd, chatting with neighbors, and participating in activities. He even joined a dance circle with some local teens, drawing laughter and cheers as he attempted to keep up with their moves. His laughter mixed with theirs, and for the first time in a long time, he felt genuinely at home. But as the sun began to set and the day's festivities wound down, a sudden commotion broke out near the entrance of the festival. Jackson's heart sank as he saw a group of his fellow officers arriving, led by Captain Reynolds. Their expressions were tense, their hands resting near their belts, and it was clear they hadn't come to join the celebration. Jackson approached them, his heart pounding. "Captain, what's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Reynolds looked at him with a mix of frustration and disappointment. "Jackson, we received a report of suspicious activity here. There's concern about crowd control, potential gang activity." Jackson shook his head, his voice firm. "Captain, there's no need for that. This is a community festival, not a riot. People are just here to enjoy the day." The captain's gaze hardened. "This neighborhood doesn't have the best reputation, Jackson. You know that. We're just here to ensure everyone stays safe." Aisha stepped forward, her voice steady and calm. "Captain Reynolds, I organized this festival. We've worked hard to make sure it's a safe, welcoming space for everyone. There's no need for heavy-handed tactics here." The captain looked at her, clearly unamused. "With all due respect, Ms. Carter, it's our job to maintain order." Jackson felt the tension in the air, sensing that the presence of the officers was beginning to unsettle the crowd. People looked on with a mix of worry and resentment, their joyful expressions giving way to guarded glances. This was exactly what he had been working to change, this immediate distrust, this chasm between the people and the law. And now, his own colleagues were risking undoing everything. "Captain, let me handle this," Jackson said, his voice low but resolute. "Please, I know these people, and they trust me. Let me make sure everything stays peaceful." Reynolds hesitated, but after a tense moment, he nodded. "All right, Jackson. But if anything goes wrong, it's on you." Jackson turned back to the crowd, feeling the weight of their gaze on him. He took a deep breath, raising his hands in a gesture of reassurance. "Everyone, it's okay," he called out, his voice steady. "The officers are here as a precaution, but we're all here to enjoy the festival. Let's keep this a peaceful, positive day." The crowd relaxed slightly, though a few wary glances remained. Aisha stood by his side, a quiet show of solidarity that gave him strength. Together, they moved through the crowd, talking with people, diffusing tension, and assuring everyone that this was still a day to celebrate unity and community. As the night wore on, the officers eventually left, satisfied that there was no threat. The festival continued, albeit with a subdued air, but Jackson knew he had managed to preserve the spirit of the day. He felt a bittersweet satisfaction, knowing that he'd made progress, but also realizing just how fragile the bonds of trust still were. When the festival ended and the last of the booths were packed away, Jackson found himself sitting alone on a bench, watching the streetlights flicker on. Aisha joined him, sitting quietly beside him. "That was intense," she said softly. Jackson nodded, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "Yeah, but I guess that's part of it, isn't it? Change isn't easy. Sometimes it's one step forward, 2 steps back." She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But you took a stand, Jackson. You showed everyone here, and even your colleagues, that things can be different." He looked at her, gratitude in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Aisha. This community, these people, they gave me a chance I didn't deserve. I just want to make it count." Aisha smiled, her gaze warm and steady. "You already have. You've done more than most would. You've proven that kindness and understanding can change even the hardest of hearts." Jackson thought back on his journey, the moments that had led him to this point. The anger, the mistakes, the humility he'd found in facing his own flaws. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that there would always be those who doubted him, both in the community and in his own ranks. But he also knew he had found a purpose worth fighting for, a cause bigger than himself. As they sat in the quiet, surrounded by the remnants of the festival, Jackson felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just a cop, a badge, a uniform. He was part of something real, something that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at home. In the weeks that followed, Jackson continued to work alongside Aisha, visiting schools, volunteering at the community center, and slowly but surely rebuilding the trust he had once fractured. His journey was far from over, but he faced it with an open heart, ready to listen, to learn, and to lead with compassion. The South Side had become more than just his beat. It was his community, his family, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect and uplift it, one act of kindness at a time.